personal experience is very clear. So like up till maybe 10 years ago, if I gave a talk about Israel-Palestine at a university, even my own university, I had to have police protection. The police had to follow me out to my car because meetings were broken up and nobody was worrying about free speech at universities.
Yeah, well, we'll get to that, yeah. Which is an issue that is kind of interesting, this notion that the left in some ways is now being seen as not promoting free speech. So I thought we should have that discussion a little bit.
Well, I'd question the notion of the left, but it's certainly happening.
Yeah.
And it's wrong in principle. And beyond that, it's just tactically insane. It's the best gift that you can give to the right.
Yeah.
If some right-wing speaker tries to go to a campus and is blocked, it's a gift. They love it, and you can see the way they're using it. This is, okay, we're the good guys.
Yeah.
We're defending freedom of speech. So if you want to give enormous gifts to the right wing and to the far right, to the neo-fascists, that's the way to do it.
I'm as concerned about. I think you're the fact that the right is usurping an issue that will come back to haunt others is one thing, but I'm equally concerned about the fact that people are afraid of ideas or discussions that make them uncomfortable.
First of all, that's always been true. But since it was always the mainstream who was fighting off the wild men in the wings, nobody noticed it. Now we're noticing it. And it was wrong then, and it's wrong now. It's even worse now with the idea that somehow, like what you said, you have to have special places where students won't hear things. This is totally crazy. I mean, if a speaker comes in who you think is extremely offensive, first of all, you don't have to go to the talk if you don't want.
Exactly.
But the sane thing to do, which sometimes is done, is to use the opportunity as an educational opportunity.
Yeah.
Go listen to them. Meanwhile, set up alternative forums where you discuss the issues, you think about them, you look at the pros and cons. Nothing is ever 100% obvious.
Yeah.
Let's go through it. Let's come out with a reasonable position. We'll have a basis, if it's the right outcome, to oppose their positions, not just shout them down, saying, well, we're so scared of them we can't even hear them.
Exactly. Shout them down, play music so they can't talk, even if they're allowed on campus.
I've had enough of that in my own experience, but that's not the reason. It's wrong, whoever does it. When the right wing is targeted, it's tactically crazy. When the left is targeted, it doesn't matter because nobody pays attention anyway.
Yeah.
But when those who have some basis in power systems are attacked, then it's tactically ridiculous because it's giving them an enormous gift.
Well, what I never see is this recognition. Well, I very rarely see it, of the fact that the whole purpose of free speech is to protect the speech of those you detest.
In principle, but the people who have upheld that have always been bitterly denounced on every issue.
Well, but you know what's...
I can give you many examples.
Yeah, but I'm pretty scared. I mean, as someone who sort of grew up in the 60s, to see that the people that I used to think of as progressive are now supporting exactly the opposite.
Yes, but that was the 60s.
Yeah.
And remember, the 60s was the period when even the Supreme Court, really for the first time, took strong positions in support of freedom of speech. That's not American history. And in fact, the freedom of speech issues didn't arise at the court level, Supreme Court, until the 20th century. And if you look at the history, it's not uplifting. First Amendment's a very weak barrier to repression. Mm-hmm. The first protections of freedom of speech were during the First World War, the famous dissents of Holmes and Brandeis. Yeah. Notice, first of all, they were dissents. Secondly, they were very limited. So in the Schenck case, the first case where Schenck, this guy was being sentenced for having written pamphlets against the war, the dissenters, Holmes, voted in favor of the decision. They said, well, too far, we've got to have a little freedom of speech, but nevertheless did it. It's a very mixed record up until the 60s. The first strong defense of freedom of speech by the court was actually in 1964. That's Times v. Sullivan, when it was a civil rights issue, when the state of Alabama declared that they were being libeled by the Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement because, racist sheriffs were being attacked. Kind of technically they were right by the thinking of the framers, but the Supreme Court overruled what's called sovereign immunity, that the state is protected from harmful speech, which holds in most countries, incidentally, including Canada, including Britain. They still have that. Right. But the United States struck it down. Then there was even further decisions. Brandenburg v. Ohio took a very strong position in favor of freedom of speech. That's 1969. It's not American history. So yes, there is a modern tradition of protection of freedom of speech, but it's not deeply rooted or sturdy. And when, say, Clarence Thomas recently said, we got to review these decisions because that's not what the framers had in mind, he's not wrong, if you really look back at the history. But nevertheless, it's true that among the countries of the world, the United States is probably supreme in protection of freedom of speech.
Yeah, I know. As one who grew up in Canada, and I used to do history of Canada. Yeah, it's amazing to see how those protections were more effective here than in Canada.
Remember the Salman Rushdie case? When this came up in Canada, there was a question debated about whether he was attacking the state religion. And they finally decided he wasn't, so it was okay because it was some other religion. In fact, in Britain, that same case, remember, this was when he was criticizing Islam.
Yeah, sure.
It went to the House of Lords, and they considered, they said, well, he isn't liable because he was condemning Islam. If he'd been condemning the Anglican Church, it would have been a different story. That's Britain. We're not talking about Nazi Germany.
No, it's...
So these are very thin reeds. And like in France, for example, there are laws. I'm bitterly condemned for having criticized them, but there are laws in France that grant the state the right to determine historical truth and to punish deviation from what they determine. And that's been used, okay? And the French left intellectuals support it. We got to stop the speech we don't like. This stuff is very thin. And the United States, by and large, has comparatively a good record. But the things you're pointing out are hitting away at some of the best things that have happened here. And unfortunately, it is coming from students, young people who just aren't thinking through what they're doing.
Not thinking through and have been brought up to, I think, to fear anything that
is a little bit uncomfortable.
Makes them a little bit uncomfortable.
But again, in the sciences, the whole history of the sciences is people challenging common sense.
That's what science is all about. If it wasn't, if we weren't uncomfortable, we're not making progress. It's So I think, okay, good. I'm glad we got that at least because I'm critically concerned about it. And anyone who's being at universities, I think, is seeing it in a way I've never witnessed.
Remember, it goes on all sides. Like I teach at the University of Arizona right now. There's a legislation at the state level requiring that at the University of Arizona, if a department invites a speaker, or if a faculty member invites somebody to come to their class, they have to inform the legislature. So if I invite somebody to talk on theoretical linguistics, I got to inform the legislature, make sure there's no communist infiltrators there.